So if you really, really, truly want to understand meditation and human consciousness as an object or as a thing that you can know, like if you're really wanting to understand the mind in that way, the absolute most information-packed thing that you can study to learn about meditation that is not itself meditation, right? Like if you read a book about something that's super helpful, like if you read a book about whatever topic, right? Like that's, if it's a well-written book, it's going to be super helpful, even though it's not the actual topic. And so the best book on meditation, on consciousness, on being as an object, not being as relational to where like you would, the only way that you would get to know the event is similar to how you would get to know a person, right? Like that's relational. And so that's a whole different ballgame than getting to know somebody as a thing, as an object. So meditation is the study of being as an object. It's basically it's the highest form of autism, to where like by trying to try and get to know somebody, to try and get to know yourself, or to try and get to know people, you're like, I'm gonna figure out the nature of their consciousness, which is like, you know, trying to figure out that they're composed of hydrogen and oxygen and stuff like that. It's just extremely autistic. And so, but basically the highest form of autism, if you're going to study reality in that way, is using water as a book, as a book that contains the details, the patterns, and the behavior of consciousness. And so meditation, if you want to intellectually understand meditation, it's identical to your experience with water. And so you drink it, you're composed of it, it carries the weather, whatever, you have all these experiences with water. And so like meditation, or if you're going to really go into water fully, like if you're really going to go into consciousness fully, you're going to go into it. You have to go into the subject, right? So water is going to teach you what it means, what all these words mean. Like when you go into something, or when you study, or when you do something with consciousness, if you use water as an analogy for consciousness, and you see all the ways that you can interact with water, you can see all the ways that you are capable of interacting with your consciousness. So normally when people are saying like, do these practices, do these techniques with your consciousness, that's normally very invisible, or like people don't know anything about it. Like, and so like if you don't know anything about consciousness, if you don't understand consciousness, it's going to be invisible to you, which is slightly different than like, say, grass. Like you might not know anything about grass, but it's not invisible to you until you read about grass, because grass is like external to you, or you're looking at it, you can see it without knowing about it. Consciousness would be like grass that you can't even perceive until you've read something about it. And so when you read something about consciousness, before you read it, you don't know about it, so it's invisible because you kind of are it. So when you read about consciousness, it disassociates you. If you actually read about consciousness correctly, the book, the material, the thing that you're doing will cause you to disassociate and look at yourself. And so when you meditate, or when you study consciousness, you're entering into it fully. So that's the same as jumping into water, like fully. So there's different degrees that you can jump into water to. You can have water up to your ankles, you can have water up to your waist, water up to your head. You can be floating in water, right? You can have water that's deeper than you are. You're also capable of floating in water that's like only a foot deep. You can like lay out on the surface and be floating in very shallow water. Or you can be sinking and not able to swim in very deep water. And then at an intermediate state, you can get by not really knowing how to walk or swim, like when you're in the tidal area. So you can, in these intermediate areas, it's interesting, like these areas of learning is just like the shore break between the shore of an ocean is just like the transition between the conscious and the unconscious. So the conscious mind is going to be going into the water, right? So that's going to happen at things like a beach. There's the natural transitions between consciousness are often very smooth, gradual. Sometimes there's cliffs. Sometimes there's establishments, there's piers, there's outdoor swimming areas, there's diving boards within which you can jump into water more easily. So there's retreats, there's methods, there's techniques, there's different types of shorelines, there's different types of activities, there's different ways of entering into water, and they're all analogically like very similar, like to the ways that you enter into consciousness. Dare I say, nearly identical. It's like as water is to consciousness as your body water is to you. It's the exact same shape. It's around everything. It's water is nearly a perfect analogy for you. Like if you were just to study the water of the body, you would get almost the entire picture correct. Right? So when you use water as an analogy for what you are, this language, this terminology, this intellectual understanding of the activity without doing the activity, you can't really get any better than applying the analogy of water to consciousness. And instantaneously, when you do that, you can just think of like, what are all the ways where I see a transition between unconsciousness would be the air, the not water, and consciousness, right? So you drink it, you take it into you. When you're drinking it, rarely are you submerged in it. Like when you're drinking consciousness to facilitate and bring life into your body, it's very rarely when you're actually swimming in it or submerged in it. They're kind of two different activities. And sometimes the water that most people like swimming in is too salty to drink. So all the things that you could learn meditatively from like ocean sports is going to be separate from the practice of drinking pure water, just to sustain and vitalize the life processes, right? So there's already here, there's different things that people are doing with their studies and with their understanding of consciousness of themselves. So everybody's drinking it a little bit. Not everybody has like a swimming practice or a bathing practice. Like people have bathing practices. These are things that people naturally, instinctively learn how to do with their consciousness. So they will bathe in themselves. Or they will, you know, dancers are like surfers, like people that do wind and wave sports. They let themselves be moved by consciousness. Sailors, like people sail. So the sailing is like equipment, right? That's a musician with a synthesizer and a piano and drums. They let the waves of consciousness move them, and it writes art, it writes inspiration, it writes whatever. So you can interact with consciousness just like people do with boats. Right? The boats catch the wind and the waves and they get propelled forward. That's the same thing that's happening with a pen, a guitar, a body, a typewriter. Like, so people are sailing these waves of consciousness, right? You can sail them across vast distances, or you can surf over this tiny little thing and just do crazy tricks, right? So you have the difference between writing poetry and writing epics. Or writing poetic epics. People are being moved by the consciousness at different scales and at different levels of reality. So it's the same consciousness that's pushing some people across an entire unknown ocean to a new land, a new way of being, a new way of thinking. Or there's people that are just like narrowing in on like, hey, here's a fish pond, or here's a wave, or here's a whirlpool, or here's the hydrogen bonding angle of the atoms, right? And that's all different ways of interacting with consciousness. So the main one, meditation, would be to submerge yourself in consciousness. So that's like jumping in, swimming, and get to the degree to which you can float. So when you're in consciousness, you'll find that your natural place where you live, where you exist, is right at the surface of reality. That's where you breathe. the transition between the oxygen going into the water and then the water is the transition between consciousness and unconsciousness, between water and not water. That's happening at the surface. So everywhere that the breath is happening is the surface of the water, is the surface of consciousness. And so in relationship to that breath, that's the surface, you can go down into consciousness, and that's like having negative buoyancy, and you can fall down into consciousness. You can sink down. You can go from the surface and you can swim down into consciousness. That's like stillness. That's meditation. That's breath work, because consciousness, the water away from the surface, is silence itself. So when you go into that silence, when you draw away from the surface of reality, all of the sense perceptions, all the breath, everything, that's the surface of reality. If you draw away from that, you're falling down into silence. How do you impact the two different levels? Like, right? Like if you have too much air in you, you're stuck to the surface of reality. If you stop breathing, or if you let your air out, that'll change your buoyancy. That's changing your polarity, so that you have a tendency to fall into being instead of getting stuck at the surface. If you have material possessions, judgments, etc., those are like big buoyancy things. Those are things that you use to keep yourself afloat in life, in the sea of consciousness. And so those things are big and massive, and you can't let go of them. It's like having a balloon or a life vest or a flotation device. You're strongly stuck to the surface of consciousness. And so if you detach from all that and actually let a little bit of air out, these are non-doing practices, non-breathing practices of like, you're not actually not breathing, but you just, I'll try and explain that in a little bit maybe, but you're exhaling and you let some air out and you actually fall into consciousness. And so you can be at the surface, or how deep can you go into consciousness? Some people can go over 100 meters down into water. Some freedivers, they train their breath and they can go 100 meters down into consciousness and come back up. What can they do down there? What's the point of it? Nothing really. But you can go down there. You can go down so deep and you can even die. You can go down so deep that you can't come back up. Like, you have the ability to go into your consciousness and swim down and not have enough energy to come back up. And that's a death experience, right? So you can do that in your own consciousness at any point. And this is kind of the same thing that people use, like very potent, powerful psychedelics will cause this to people. It's a big deal, kind of a not big deal, but you can actually fall or sink down so deeply into your consciousness, that which sunk down lacks the energy to get back up, and it dies, it vanishes into consciousness. And then somehow, like magically, it reforms at the surface again with like no memory of the intermediary period. It just recoalesces. And some people that are curious do it a few times, but for the most part, it's not something that you're really attracted to, or like it's good, you know, maybe it's it's like a thing. Some people have it to be like a certain type of bravado that they search for their whole life, right? So you have this ability to go in and out of consciousness to the point of dying if you do it in a way like that, if you go too far. But otherwise, you can go down and up, and you go, so that's the same as being able to go down or up in water. So if you go down a little bit to where you're totally submerged, there's all these different types of abilities and sensitivities that come out, because you're weightless and perfectly balanced and in harmony or in alignment with all things. Like if you're down under the surface, like it's the waves that are out of alignment with each other. Underneath the surface, the water is one being, one thing. So when you drop down into it, at whatever activity that you're doing, like whatever thing, it's in harmony, it's in balance. And so that's different types of yogic powers, physical freedom. Different types of freedom that people experience is from being deeper in the consciousness, and so it's more floaty. It's more, you're the bigger wave. Like when you're deeper in it, you're a bigger wave. You're in, like that's wealth. That's just being in domination of a situation. Is that it's not like two waves of an equal size, one of them has a better vantage point. It's like those waves are happening on top of a deeper wave, like the bigger, deeper wave. So as you sink down into consciousness, by de facto, that location is the bigger, deeper wave enveloping or in control of all of the lesser waves. And so as you play in this field of consciousness in consciousness, as a being made of water floating in water, meditation would not be, you could get stuck up on what depth am I at? Am I breathing at the correct depth? Have I mastered it? Am I free? Am I whatever? Where does the freedom in the water start? At what depth does the freedom of the water start? And you can eventually find that the freedom of the water is not the depth or the surface or the silence or anything. There's flotation happening. You're floating all the time. You're being lifted up by the water equally, whether or not you're stuck to the surface or even sinking. If you're sinking, it's the same flotation. You've just given up so much that it's not enough to keep you afloat. Like all of your more godly things start to drag you down into death, into the depths of being. Like if you give up enough of that which you are not, like the air, the breath, you just start to sink. But even when you're sinking, there's still the same amount of flotation, buoyancy, connection with what is. That's this upwelling, this upward force that causes you to float. And you can generate more of that upward force by moving. Intelligent movement, as you move through the water, it actually causes lift, right? That's why you can tread water to keep yourself afloat. As you move your hands back and forth this way, you're actually creating something that the water is supporting, which is buoyancy. So that's the act of creation, the same way that you're able to create a pattern in the water that the water itself sees as separate, recognizes and supports buoyancy. You can move, and so all the movements are starting to create lift. It's either adding to the creation. And so you get more and more floaty, but that lift is happening all the time. Even if you're not moving at all, the water is still lifting you to the degree that you're in it. And maybe you